Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself walking the streets of modern Paris at twilight. Beneath your feet, beneath the cobblestones and metro tunnels, beneath centuries of construction and memory, lies the ghost of another city entirely. A Roman city called Lutetia. Born from swamp and mud along the Seine, it rose with forums, amphitheatres and grand public baths. For centuries it thrived. And then, slowly, quietly, it disappeared. Its stones were carried away, its streets buried, its name nearly forgotten. Today, most Parisians walk above it without ever knowing it was there. So what became of ancient Lutetia? How does an entire city vanish beneath time? And what can its fragments, now surfacing in crypts and excavations, teach us about impermanence, memory, and the layers of history we build our lives upon? But before we descend into the shadows, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It means the world to me, and I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Before the city of stone and imperial grandeur, before the forums and the amphitheatres, before Rome ever cast its shadow across the Seine, there was something quieter, simpler, more intimate with the land itself. There was a people who knew this river not as a boundary on a map or a strategic crossing point for legions, but as a living presence, a source of sustenance, a pathway through the world. They called themselves the Parisii, and they were children of the water and the marsh. Imagine, if you will, the landscape as it was more than 2,000 years ago. The Seine meanders through a basin of low hills and broad floodplains, its course slower and wider than today, braiding into channels and backwaters, spreading across wetlands that breathe with the seasons. The river is flanked by marshes, thick with reeds and sedges, alive with the hum of insects and the calls of waterfowl. Small islands rise here and there from the water, gravel bars crowned with willow and alder, offering precious patches of dry ground in a world dominated by mud and current. The air smells of damp earth, of rotting vegetation, of the fecund richness of river silt. In spring the waters rise, reclaiming the low ground, transforming fields and paths into shallow lakes. In summer, the marshes retreat, leaving behind cracked mud and tangled roots. This is not a landscape that invites the construction of great monuments or the establishment of permanent cities. It is a landscape that asks for adaptation, for humility, for a patient relationship with water, and the Parisii, like many Celtic peoples of Gaul, understood this. They built their lives around the rhythms of the river, dwelling on the islands and the higher banks, constructing homes of timber and thatch, fishing the waters, ferrying goods along the Seine, and cultivating what patches of arable land they could claim from the marsh. The Parisii were not a vast or powerful tribe by the standards of their age. They held territory along a stretch of the Seine, a modest domain compared to the great confederations and kingdoms that dominated other parts of Gaul. But what they lacked in size they made up for in resourcefulness, and in their intimate knowledge of the river. They were boatmen, traders, fishermen. They knew every current and eddy, every ford and crossing. They understood how to read the water, how to navigate the shifting channels, how to transport goods and people across a landscape that resisted the straight lines and fixed roads of more settled civilizations. Their settlement, such as it was, likely consisted of scattered clusters of dwellings on the islands and along the riverbanks, connected by wooden bridges and ferries surrounded by fields and fishing grounds. Archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, obscured by centuries of a later construction, but what little has been found suggests a community that was neither grand nor primitive, but competent, pragmatic, embedded in its environment. They worked bronze and iron, wove textiles, produced pottery. They traded with neighbouring tribes, exchanging goods along the river routes that connected the interior of Gaul to the wider world. And they gave this place a name, or rather, the name that comes down to us through Roman sources, the name that the Romans used when they arrived and began to build their city here, is Lutetia. The etymology of this word is uncertain, as so many ancient names are, but the most compelling theory links it to a Celtic root meaning mud or swamp or mire. Lutetia, the city of mud. It is not a name that evokes grandeur or permanence. It is a name that speaks to the fundamental character of this place, to the waterlogged earth, to the marshes and the silt, to the precarious relationship between land and river. You might think of mud as a humble substance, something to be avoided or overcome, an obstacle to civilization. But for the Parisii, mud was not an enemy. It was the medium of their existence, the foundation of their world. The mud of the Seine basin was rich and fertile, renewed each year by the river's floods. It sustained the reeds and the fish, the willow groves and the waterfowl. It could be shaped and moulded, packed into walls, used to seal the hulls of boats. It was the substance from which life emerged, the interface between water and earth, fluidity and solidity. Living in such a landscape required a particular kind of wisdom, a resignation to impermanence, an acceptance that the boundaries between land and water were always negotiable, always shifting. The Parisii did not build fortresses of stone on high hills, did not carve their settlements into mountainsides. They lived lightly, adapted constantly, moved with the rhythms of the river rather than against them. Their wealth was measured not in grand architecture but in boats and livestock, in trade goods and river rights, in the intangible knowledge of how to survive and thrive in a world of water, and for generations this was enough. The Parisii fished the Seine, ferried traders and travellers across its waters, tended their animals and their fields, worshipped their gods in sacred groves and at riverside shrines. They were part of a larger Celtic world, connected by language and culture and trade to tribes across Gaul and beyond. But they were also profoundly local, shaped by the particular character of this river, this marsh, this mud. They could not have known, in those quiet generations before Rome arrived, that their homeland would one day bear the weight of empire, that stone forums and amphitheatres would rise from the mud, that the name of their tribe would outlast the name of their conquerors, that the city built on their swampy islands would endure for millennia. They lived in the present tense, as most people do, attending to the immediate demands of survival and community, unaware that they were laying down the first faint outline of a city that would one day be called Paris. The river world of the Parisii did not exist in isolation. Beyond the marshes and the Seine, across the hills and forests of Gaul, great forces were stirring. Tribes clashed and allied, territories shifted, and from the south, from the shores of the Mediterranean, came the inexorable expansion of Rome. By the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, much of Gaul had already fallen under Roman influence or direct control. The legions had marched north, bringing with them roads and fortifications, trade networks and tribute systems, the architecture of conquest. And in 58 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar himself arrived in Gaul with his armies, ostensibly to protect Roman allies from migrating Germanic tribes, but in truth to carve out glory and wealth for himself through the subjugation of the Celtic peoples. The Gallic Wars, as they came to be known, were a protracted and brutal campaign that would last nearly a decade. Caesar's commentaries on these wars paint them as a civilizing mission, a necessary intervention to bring order to a fractious and barbaric land. But from the perspective of the Gauls themselves, this was an invasion, a systematic conquest that threatened their independence, their cultures, their very existence. Tribe after tribe was subdued through a combination of military force, diplomacy, and ruthless calculation. And in the year 52 before the Common Era, the Gallic peoples made one final desperate attempt to throw off Roman domination. Under the leadership of a young Arverni nobleman named Vercingetorix, a coalition of Gallic tribes united in rebellion. It was a remarkable moment, a rare instance of coordination among peoples who had long been divided by rivalry and competition. Vercingetorix understood that the only hope of defeating Rome lay in unity, in presenting a single front against the legions, and for a time, the rebellion succeeded. Roman forces were harried, supply lines disrupted, fortresses besieged. Caesar himself was forced onto the defensive, his confidence shaken by the ferocity and organization of the Gallic resistance. But the rebellion could not be sustained indefinitely. Caesar was a master of logistics and tactical innovation, and he possessed resources that the Gauls could not match. Slowly, methodically, he regained the initiative, isolating Vercingetorix and his forces, cutting off their supplies, forcing them into a climactic confrontation at the fortified town of Alesia. There, through a combination of engineering genius and sheer persistence, Caesar laid siege to the Gallic army, constructing elaborate circumvallations that trapped Vercingetorix inside, while simultaneously defending against relief forces from without. The siege dragged on for weeks, starvation and exhaustion eroding the will of the defenders, until finally Vercingetorix surrendered, offering himself to Caesar in the hope of sparing his people further suffering. The fall of Alesia broke the back of Gallic resistance, but it did not end the war entirely. Scattered fighting continued across Gaul as individual tribes and warlords made their own decisions about whether to submit or to fight on. And it was in this context, in the aftermath of Alesia, that the Parisii and their river homeland entered the pages of Roman history. In the year 52 before the Common Era, as Caesar consolidated his hold on central Gaul, he dispatched one of his most trusted officers, Titus Labienus, to secure the region around the Seine. Labienus was a capable and ruthless commander, a man who understood the importance of controlling river crossings and supply routes. His objective was to subdue the tribes of the lower Seine valley, to secure the routes north toward the coast, and to prevent any resurgence of resistance in Caesar's rear. The Parisii, faced with the approach of Roman legions, found themselves in an impossible position. They could submit without a fight, accepting Roman overlordship and the loss of their independence. Or they could resist, knowing that resistance would likely be futile, that the legions would crush them as they had crushed so many others. The historical sources, filtered through Roman accounts, suggest that the Parisii chose a third path, one that was both defiant and pragmatic, both heroic and heartbreaking. As Labienus advanced toward their territory, the Parisii made a decision that speaks to the depth of their desperation. Rather than allow their settlement to fall intact into Roman hands, rather than permit the legions to use their bridges and their boats and their stores against them, they burned their own town. They destroyed the wooden bridges that spanned the Seine, set fire to the timber structures that lined the riverbanks, and withdrew to the opposite shore. It was an act of self-erasure, a deliberate obliteration of their own material world in the hope of denying the enemy any advantage. The Roman forces, arriving at the riverbank, found themselves confronted by a charred ruin and a wide, fast-flowing river with no easy means of crossing. The Parisii, reinforced by warriors from neighbouring tribes, had positioned themselves on the far shore, ready to contest any attempt to ford the Seine. For a moment the situation was stalemated, but Labienus was not easily deterred. He located an alternative crossing point upstream, divided his forces, and executed a flanking manoeuvre that caught the Gallic defenders off guard. In the ensuing battle, fought on the plains near what is now the Parisian suburb of Grenelle, the Parisii and their allies were defeated. The sources speak of heavy casualties, of warriors falling in great numbers, of the collapse of organised resistance. The burning of their settlement, the destruction of their bridges, the loss of so many lives in battle, all of this was in vain. The Romans crossed the Seine, occupied the ruins, and extended their control over the region. The independence of the Parisii was extinguished. Their river world, the swampy homeland that had sustained them for generations, now belonged to Rome. And yet, in the strange alchemy of history, this moment of defeat and erasure became, paradoxically, a moment of transformation. The Romans, having conquered the territory, did not abandon it. They saw its strategic value, its position along the Seine, its potential as a crossing point and a trade hub, and so, on the ashes of the Parisii settlement, they began to build something new, something more permanent, something that would endure long after the memory of the burning bridges had faded into legend. The transformation did not happen overnight. Roman conquest was never simply a matter of military victory followed by immediate occupation. It was a gradual process, a slow imposition of order and infrastructure, a patient remaking of the landscape according to Roman logic and Roman needs. In the years and decades following the defeat of the Parisii, the land along the Seine began to change, not through sudden upheaval, but through the steady accumulation of walls and roads, forums and aqueducts, all the apparatus of imperial civilization. The Romans were builders above all else. They believed in permanence, in stone and concrete, in structures that would outlast the lifetimes of their creators. Where the Parisii had built with timber and thatch, adapting to the seasonal rhythms of the river, the Romans imposed fixity. Where the Celts had lived lightly on the land, accepting the fluidity of marsh and floodplain, the Romans drained and terraced, filled and levelled, creating stable ground where none had existed before. This was not cruelty exactly, though it was undoubtedly a violence against the existing order of things. It was simply the Roman way, the conviction that human ingenuity could and should reshape the world to suit human purposes. The new settlement that rose on the banks of the Seine was given a name, or rather, retained a version of the name that had existed before: Lutetia, the city of mud. Whether the Romans chose this name out of respect for local tradition, or simply because it was the term their soldiers and surveyors had learned from the native population, we cannot know, but the name endured, even as the character of the place was utterly transformed. The Romans did not build their city on the low-lying islands and riverbanks where the Parisii had dwelt. Those areas, prone to flooding, difficult to fortify, were unsuitable for the kind of urban development the Romans had in mind. Instead, they turned their attention to the higher ground on the southern bank of the Seine, the slopes of a hill that rose above the floodplain, commanding a view of the river and the surrounding countryside. This hill, which would later be known as the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, offered everything the Romans valued: elevation, drainage, defensibility, and solid ground for building. The construction of Roman Lutetia followed a pattern that was replicated across the empire, from Britain to Syria, from Spain to the Balkans. It was a formula, refined over centuries, designed to create functional, legible urban spaces that could be administered efficiently and defended effectively. At the heart of this formula was the grid, the orthogonal arrangement of streets that divided the city into regular blocks, oriented according to the cardinal directions or aligned with natural features like rivers and ridgelines. In Lutetia, the main north-south street, the Cardo Maximus, ran roughly along the ridge of the hill, tracing a line that would, in later centuries, become the Rue Saint-Jacques. This was the spine of the city, the primary artery along which traffic and commerce flowed. Perpendicular to it, running east to west, was the Decumanus, the secondary axis that completed the basic framework of the urban grid. From these two main streets, smaller streets branched off, dividing the city into insulae, blocks that could be parcelled out for housing, workshops, temples, and public buildings. The surveying and laying out of these streets was a task that required precision and expertise. Roman engineers used tools of remarkable sophistication: the groma for establishing right angles, the chorobates for levelling, the dioptra for measuring angles and distances. They drove stakes into the ground, stretched cords between them, sighted along lines, calculated grades and slopes. It was painstaking work, but it created a city that was legible, orderly, a city where one could navigate by logic rather than memory, where every street and block fit into a comprehensible pattern. Once the grid was established, the work of construction could begin in earnest. Stone had to be quarried from nearby hillsides, limestone and gypsum extracted and shaped into blocks. Timber had to be felled from the surrounding forests, transported to the city, cut and seasoned for use in roofs and scaffolding. Clay had to be dug, formed into bricks and tiles, fired in kilns until it was hard and durable. Sand and gravel had to be dredged from the riverbed, mixed with lime to make mortar. The labour required for all of this was immense, drawn from the local population, from soldiers stationed in the region, from slaves and prisoners and hired workers. The buildings that rose from this labour were solid and imposing. Foundations were laid deep, trenches dug into the hillside and filled with rubble and concrete to create stable platforms. Walls were constructed of dressed stone, mortared and pointed, sometimes faced with finer materials for aesthetic effect. Roofs were tiled, supported by wooden trusses and beams designed to shed rain and snow efficiently. Floors were paved with stone or concrete, sometimes decorated with mosaics in the wealthier structures. It was architecture built to last, to withstand the centuries, to proclaim the permanence and power of Rome. The Forum, the civic and commercial heart of any Roman city, was positioned prominently on the hill, likely near the intersection of the Cardo and Decumanus. Here, a large open plaza was created, paved with stone, surrounded by colonnades and porticos that provided shelter from sun and rain. Public buildings flanked the Forum, a basilica for legal proceedings and administrative functions, temples dedicated to Roman gods and deified emperors, perhaps a curia where local magistrates met to conduct the business of governance. The Forum was more than just a marketplace, though merchants certainly set up stalls under the porticos to sell their wares. It was a stage for public life, a place where citizens gathered to hear proclamations, to witness ceremonies, to participate in the rituals of civic identity. Around the Forum, the city spread outward in its orderly grid. Residential blocks contained houses of varying sizes and degrees of comfort, from modest single-room dwellings to more elaborate domus with multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards. Workshops and taverns occupied street-level spaces, their doorways opening directly onto the thoroughfares, inviting the flow of foot traffic and commerce. Warehouses stored goods brought upriver by boat or overland by cart. Bath complexes, essential to Roman urban life, were constructed with hypocausts to heat water and warm the air, with pools of varying temperatures, with exercise yards and lounging areas. And gradually, over the span of decades, Lutetia ceased to be merely a strategic outpost or a military garrison. It became a city, a living organism of stone and wood and human activity, a node in the vast network of Roman civilization connected by roads to other cities, by the river to the sea, by trade and administration and shared culture to the wider empire. The mud of the Parissi had been paved over, but it still lay beneath, a reminder of what had been, a foundation upon which something new and foreign and enduring had been built. To understand what life was like in Roman Lutetia at its height, we must slow down, step away from the grand narratives of conquest and construction, and attend to the ordinary rhythms of daily existence. For most people, most of the time, history is not made in moments of crisis or transformation, but in the patient repetition of mundane tasks, waking, eating, working, sleeping. It is in these rhythms that a city truly lives, that a civilization reveals its character. Imagine yourself arriving in Lutetia on a morning in the 2nd century of the Common Era, when the city has settled into its role as a modest but prosperous provincial town. You approach from the south, following one of the paved roads that radiate outward from the city, connecting it to the wider network of Roman Gaul. The road is straight and well maintained, its surface of fitted stones worn smooth by the passage of countless feet and wheels. As you crest a rise and catch your first glimpse of the city, you see it spread across the slopes of the hill, its buildings clustered along the grid of streets, their terracotta roofs glowing warm in the morning light. You descend toward the city, passing through the necropolis that flanks the road outside the urban boundary. Here, the dead are commemorated with modest stone markers and monuments, some simple slabs inscribed with names and ages, others more elaborate structures with carved reliefs and epitaphs. The Romans did not bury their dead within the city walls, but along the roads leading in and out, so that the living and the dead remained in constant proximity, a reminder of mortality and continuity. Entering the city proper, you find yourself on the Cardo Maximus, the main street that runs along the spine of the hill. The street is wide enough for 2 carts to pass comfortably, its surface paved with large stone blocks, slightly cambered to allow rainwater to drain into gutters at the edges. On either side, buildings rise 2 or sometimes 3 stories, their ground floors occupied by shops and workshops that open directly onto the street. You walk past a potter's establishment, where amphorae and cooking vessels are stacked in rows, their surfaces still dusty from the kiln. Next door, a blacksmith's forge glows with heat, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil marking time like a heartbeat. Further along, a tavern displays wine amphorae and hanging strings of onions and garlic, inviting travellers and locals alike to pause for refreshment. The street is alive with movement and sound. Merchants call out to passers-by, extolling the quality of their wares. A cart pulled by oxen rumbles past, its wheels clattering over the stones, laden with sacks of grain or bundles of firewood. A slave hurries by carrying a basket of vegetables from the market, eyes downcast, intent on his errand. 2 women pause to converse beneath the shade of a portico, their voices soft, their gestures animated. A dog noses through refuse in the gutter, searching for scraps. Overhead, pigeons roost on the eaves and cornices, their cooing a constant soothing background murmur. As you continue up the street, the commercial bustle gradually gives way to a more open, ceremonial atmosphere. You're approaching the Forum, the civic heart of Lutetia. Here, the buildings are grander, their facades more deliberately imposing. The street widens into a broad plaza, paved with larger, finer stones, surrounded on 3 sides by colonnaded porticos. The columns are of local limestone, their capitals carved in the Tuscan order, simple and sturdy rather than ornate. Beneath the porticos, in the shade of the colonnade, merchants have set up temporary stalls, displaying textiles, metalwork, pottery, spices, dried fish, olive oil imported from the south. The forum is never entirely quiet, never entirely empty. Even in the early morning, it hums with activity, with negotiation and exchange, with the constant flow of goods and currency that sustains urban life. At the far end of the plaza stands the Basilica, a long rectangular building with a high roof supported by interior columns. This is the seat of legal and administrative authority in Lutetia, the place where disputes are heard, contracts witnessed, public records kept. On certain days, magistrates hold court here, presiding over cases brought by citizens and residents, rendering judgments according to Roman law. On other days, the space serves more informal purposes, as a meeting place for merchants, a venue for public announcements, a shelter from rain or excessive heat. Adjacent to the Basilica, you might find a temple or shrine, dedicated perhaps to Jupiter or Mars, or to one of the syncretic deities that blend Roman and Celtic traditions. The temple is smaller than its urban counterparts in Rome or Lyon, a modest structure with a columned portico and a simple cellar housing a cult statue. On festival days, priests conduct sacrifices here, offerings of wine and incense, sometimes the blood of animals, performed according to rituals that are ancient and precise. But on an ordinary morning the temple is quiet, its doors standing open, a faint scent of old smoke and oils lingering in the air. Beyond the forum the city spreads outward in its orderly grid, a mix of public and private spaces, sacred and profane, commercial and residential. You wander through narrower side streets, catching glimpses of domestic life through open doorways. A woman grinding grain with a hand mill, the slow circular motion of stone on stone. A child playing with a wooden toy in a sunlit courtyard. An old man sitting on a stool, mending a fishing net with patient, practiced fingers. These are not the grand gestures of empire, not the monuments that endure in stone and inscription, but the small, essential acts that make a city livable, that bind people together in webs of mutual dependence and shared routine. The river, always the river, remains the lifeblood of Lutetia. Though the city now sits primarily on the higher ground above the floodplain, the Seine still defines its existence. Wharves and docks line the riverbank where boats are moored, their hulls rocking gently with the current. Boatmen unload cargoes of timber and grain, amphorae of wine, bundles of hides, crates of pottery and glassware. These goods flow into the city's markets and workshops, are consumed or transformed or sent onward along other routes. The boatmen themselves form a guild, the Snati Parisiazzi, a fraternity bound by shared labour and shared interest, recognised by the city authorities, honoured with public monuments. Their pillar of the boatmen, erected in the early 1st century, stands as a testament to their civic pride, carved with images of gods both Roman and Celtic, a visible symbol of the cultural blending that defines Lutetia's identity. This, then, is the city at its height. Not grand, not vast, but functional and alive, a place where the machinery of Roman civilization meshes with the older rhythms of the river and the land, where stone and timber, law and custom, empire and locality coexist in a delicate, productive balance. Among all the amenities that defined Roman urban life, perhaps none was more essential, more deeply woven into the fabric of daily existence, than the public baths. To modern sensibilities, the idea of bathing as a communal social activity might seem strange, even uncomfortable. But for the Romans, the thermae were far more than places of hygiene. They were institutions of leisure and sociability, spaces where the boundaries between public and private, between body and community, dissolved in steam and warm water. Lutetia, though modest in scale compared to the great cities of the empire, possessed at least one substantial bath complex, and likely several smaller establishments scattered throughout the city. The remains of one such complex survive today, incorporated into the foundations of what is now the Musée de Cluny, on the slopes of the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. Walking through those ruins, even in their fragmentary state, one can begin to reconstruct the sensory experience of the baths, to imagine the vaulted halls filled with the hiss of steam, the murmur of conversation, the echoing splash of water. The construction of a Roman bath was an engineering marvel, a testament to the sophistication of Roman hydraulic technology. The basic principle was simple enough. Heat water, channel it into pools and chambers, create spaces of varying temperatures where bathers could move from hot to warm to cold, cleansing and invigorating the body through this progression. But the execution required considerable expertise and infrastructure. First, water had to be supplied in abundance. For this, the Romans constructed an aqueduct, a channel that brought fresh water from springs located miles away in the hills south of the city. The aqueduct followed the contours of the land, maintaining a gentle but consistent downward gradient, relying on gravity alone to move water from source to city. At certain points, the channel was elevated on stone arches to maintain its level across valleys and depressions. At others, it was carved into the hillside or built as a covered conduit just below the surface. The engineering required to achieve this was precise. Too steep a grade and the water would flow too rapidly, eroding the channel. Too shallow and the water would stagnate or fail to reach its destination. The water, once it reached Lutetia, was distributed through a network of lead and ceramic pipes to various public and private buildings. The baths received a particularly generous allocation, for their operations were water-intensive. Pools had to be filled and refreshed regularly. Steam rooms required constant supplies of hot water. Fountains and basins in exercise yards and changing rooms needed to flow continuously. The sheer volume of water moving through the baths on any given day was staggering, a luxury made possible only by the aqueduct's reliable supply. Heating this water and warming the air in the bath chambers required another engineering innovation, the hypercaust. This was a system of underfloor heating in which hot air from a furnace circulated beneath raised floors and within hollow walls, radiating warmth throughout the space. The furnace itself was a wood-fired chamber tended by slaves who fed it constantly, maintaining the temperatures necessary for the different rooms. The caldarium, the hot room, was kept almost oppressively warm, its air thick with steam. The tepidarium, the warm room, offered a more moderate climate. The frigidarium, the cold room, contained unheated water, providing a bracing contrast to the heat of the other chambers. You enter the baths in the late afternoon, when the day's labour is done and the city's inhabitants gather for their daily ritual of cleansing and relaxation. You pass through the entrance and into the apoditerium, the changing room, where you remove your clothing and leave it in a niche or entrust it to an attendant. The room is simple, functional, its walls plastered and painted with frescoes that have faded over time. Other bathers move around you, some arriving, some departing, their conversations creating a gentle ambient hum. From the changing room you proceed to the palestra, the exercise yard, an open courtyard where men engage in light physical activity before bathing. Wrestling, ball games, lifting weights, running. The yard is surrounded by a colonnade, and in its centre stands a fountain where bathers can splash themselves with cold water. You might spend a few minutes here, loosening your muscles, working up a sweat, preparing your body for the heat to come. Then you enter the warm interior of the baths proper. The transition is immediate and enveloping. The air is thick, humid, fragrant with oils and unguents. The light is softer here, filtered through high windows and reflected off wet stone and tile. Your footsteps echo on the marble floor as you make your way through the tepidarium, adjusting to the warmth, feeling your skin respond, your pores opening. The caldarium is the heart of the experience. You step into a large vaulted chamber, its ceiling soaring above you, its walls lined with alcoves and basins. The heat is intense but not unbearable, a dry warmth that seems to penetrate to your very bones. Steam rises from pools of hot water, swirling in the air, catching the light that filters down from windows set high in the walls. Other bathers recline on stone benches along the walls, their bodies glistening with sweat and oil. Attendants move among them, offering strigils, the curved bronze scrapers used to remove dirt and oil from the skin, or pouring water over heated stones to create bursts of steam. You immerse yourself in one of the hot pools, feeling the water envelop you, its heat working into tired muscles, easing tension, inducing a state of profound relaxation. Around you, conversations drift, soft and unhurried. Two men discuss the price of grain, their voices low and thoughtful. A group of younger bathers laugh at some shared joke, their mirth echoing off the stone. An older man sits in silence, eyes closed, lost in his own thoughts, or perhaps in the simple pleasure of warmth and stillness. After a time, you move to the frigidarium, plunging into the cold pool with a shock that jolts you back to alertness, that makes your skin tingle and your breath come sharp and quick. The contrast is invigorating, a reset, a reminder of the body's resilience and adaptability. You climb out, water streaming from your limbs, feeling cleansed and renewed. Finally, you return to the tepidarium, or perhaps to a quieter alcove, where you might have oil massaged into your skin, where you might sit and converse with friends or simply rest in the pleasant lassitude that follows the bath. There is no hurry here, no urgency. Time moves differently in the baths, stretched and softened by warmth and water, by the rituals of care for the body and the easy companionship of shared space. The baths were, in this sense, democratic spaces, open to citizens and non-citizens alike, to rich and poor, to the old and the young. For the price of a small fee, anyone could enter and partake of the same comforts, the same luxuries of heat and water and leisure. Here, social hierarchies did not disappear entirely, but they softened, blurred by the steam, by the common vulnerability of naked bodies, by the shared human need for cleanliness and rest. If the baths represented the intimate contemplative side of Roman urban life, then the amphitheatre embodied something quite different. The collective experience of spectacle, the communal gathering of thousands of bodies in a single space, united in their attention to performance, competition, or drama. The Romans were builders of such spaces across their empire, from the vast Colosseum in the capital to modest, provincial arenas in distant frontier towns, and Lutetia, despite its relatively small population, possessed its own amphitheatre, a structure whose ambition seemed to exceed the city's actual needs, hinting perhaps at aspirations that outran reality. The amphitheatre of Lutetia, known today as the Arène de Lutèce, was constructed sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era, likely during the period of the city's most vigorous expansion. Its location was carefully chosen, on the eastern edge of the city, where the ground sloped gently downward, allowing the builders to excavate into the hillside and use the natural terrain to support the tiers of seating. This was a common technique in Roman amphitheatre construction, a way of reducing the amount of material and labour required, while creating a structure that felt both monumental and integrated into the landscape. The amphitheatre was designed according to the standard Roman model, an oval arena at the centre, surrounded by rising tiers of stone benches arranged in a continuous curve. The spectators entered through vaulted passages called vomitoria, which allowed crowds to flow in and out efficiently, distributing themselves throughout the seating without congestion or disorder. The arena floor itself was paved with sand or compacted earth, providing a surface suitable for the various events that might take place there: gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, theatrical performances, public ceremonies. The scale of the structure is worth considering. Archaeological estimates suggest that the amphitheatre could accommodate somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 spectators, a remarkable capacity given that the city's population at its height likely numbered no more than 5,000 to 8,000 souls. This disparity raises questions. Was the amphitheatre built to serve not just the city itself, but the surrounding rural population, drawing farmers and villagers from the countryside for special events and festivals? Was it an expression of civic pride, a statement of ambition and status, an attempt to present Lutetia as a proper Roman city worthy of imperial attention? Or was it simply an example of the tendency, common throughout the empire, to build grandly and optimistically, assuming that growth and prosperity would continue indefinitely? Whatever the motivations behind its construction, the amphitheatre became a focal point of communal life in Lutetia, a place where the city's inhabitants gathered to witness spectacles that were at once entertainment and ritual, diversion and social affirmation. You might imagine yourself among the crowd on a festival day, ascending one of the stone staircases that lead up through the tiers of seating, finding your place among the benches according to your social status and wealth. The lower tiers, closest to the arena, were reserved for the elite: magistrates, wealthy merchants, military officers, their families. The middle tiers accommodated the bulk of the free population: artisans, shopkeepers, small landowners, labourers. The upper tiers, furthest from the action and exposed to sun and weather, were for slaves and the very poor, those whose presence was tolerated but whose comfort was of little concern. The seating is hard stone, worn smooth by the passage of countless bodies over the decades. You settle onto the bench, shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours, feeling the press and warmth of the crowd, hearing the murmur of conversation that fills the space like the hum of bees in a hive. Children dart through the aisles, their voices shrill with excitement. Vendors move through the crowd selling refreshments, bread, dried fruit, watered wine. The air smells of sweat and dust, of food and perfume, of the mingled scents of thousands of people gathered in close proximity. The event begins with a procession, a formal parade of participants entering the arena through one of the gated passages. Musicians play horns and drums, their sounds echoing off the stone walls. Officials and priests process solemnly, carrying standards and sacred objects, performing rituals that invoke the favour of the gods. Then come the performers or combatants, depending on the nature of the day's entertainment. Gladiators in their armour, moving with the controlled grace of trained fighters, actors in masks and costumes, preparing to enact a drama or comedy, beast handlers leading exotic animals, creatures brought from distant provinces to be displayed or pitted against one another. The spectacle itself is difficult to characterize in simple terms. To modern sensibilities, much of what took place in Roman amphitheatres seems brutal, even barbaric. Men fighting to the death for the amusement of crowds, animals slaughtered in elaborate hunts, criminals executed in public as part of the day's entertainment. And yet, for the Romans, these events were not merely crude violence. They were expressions of power and order, demonstrations of courage and skill, rituals that reinforce social hierarchies and collective identity. The gladiator, though often a slave or condemned criminal, could achieve a kind of heroic status through his performance in the arena, earning the admiration of the crowd, the favour of wealthy patrons, perhaps even his freedom. But not all events in the amphitheatre were violent or bloody. The space also hosted theatrical performances, musical competitions, public readings, religious ceremonies. On certain occasions, the arena might be flooded with water to stage mock naval battles, though whether the amphitheatre in Lutetia was equipped for such spectacles is uncertain. More likely, the events here were modest in scale, suited to a provincial audience, local gladiators rather than famous champions, small troops of actors rather than elaborate theatrical companies, exhibitions of skill and bravery rather than grandiose displays of imperial wealth. What mattered, perhaps more than the specific content of the events, was the experience of gathering, of being part of a crowd, of participating in a shared ritual. The amphitheatre was a place where the individual was subsumed into the collective, where social distinctions were both reinforced and temporarily transcended by the common focus on the arena below. You sit among thousands, your attention directed toward the same spectacle, your emotions rising and falling in response to the same moments of tension, triumph, or tragedy. The boundaries of self soften in such moments. You become part of something larger, a communal body with its own rhythms and energies. And when the day's events conclude, when the crowds begin to disperse, filtering back out through the vomitoria and down the hillside toward the city, there is a sense of satisfaction, of having participated in something significant, even if you cannot quite articulate what that significance is. The amphitheatre has served its purpose. It has entertained, yes, but more than that, it has gathered the community, reminded its members of their shared identity, their place within the larger structure of Roman civilization. It has made visible, in stone and spectacle, the power and order that Rome claimed to bring to the world. Away from the grand public monuments, away from the polished stone of the Forum and the echoing vaults of the baths, there existed another Lutetia. This was the city of workshops and hearths, of clay-dusted hands and timber shavings, of the steady rhythm of hammer on metal and the slow turn of the potter's wheel. This was where the city truly lived, in the quiet industry of those who shaped its material world. Walk with me now through the narrower streets that branch away from the main thoroughfares. Here the buildings press closer together, their timber frames and wattle and daub walls creating a different kind of geometry than the stone grandeur of the public spaces. Smoke rises from countless hearths, carrying the mingled scents of cooking fires, forge heat, and kiln smoke. The air itself seems textured, thick with the evidence of human labour. In one workshop, a potter sits at his wheel, his foot maintaining that ancient hypnotic rhythm as clay rises and falls beneath his practised hands. The wheel itself is a simple thing, turned by foot power, but in the hands of a master it becomes an instrument of transformation. Watch as formless earth becomes vessel, becomes cup. becomes the containers that will hold wine and oil and grain. The clay comes from the riverbanks, dug and processed and mixed with water until it achieves that perfect consistency, neither too wet nor too dry. Each piece will be dried in the shade, then fired in kilns that glow red in the darkness, reaching temperatures that turn soft clay into stone-hard ceramic. The potter is not alone in his craft. Archaeological excavations in the necropolis that ring the city, those cities of the dead that line the roads leading out from Lutetia, have revealed the material culture of everyday life. The graves yield ceramic vessels by the hundreds, glass bottles and beakers, metal implements, coins, jewellery, the accoutrements of ordinary existence carried into death. These objects speak of workshops scattered throughout the city, of craftsmen who supplied the living with the tools and vessels of daily life. In another quarter you might hear the ring of metal on metal, the particular music of the forge. Blacksmiths work iron drawn from regional sources, heating and hammering and shaping it into nails and hinges, tools and implements, the metal bones that hold together a wooden world. The heat from the forge is tremendous, a physical presence that washes over you in waves. The smith's face gleams with sweat as he draws a piece of iron from the coals, its end glowing orange-white, and begins the rhythmic hammering that will shape it to his purpose. Sparks fly with each strike, brief constellations that die in the air. Glassmakers ply their mysterious art in workshops kept deliberately secret, for the making of glass is a valuable skill. They work with sand and soda ash and lime, heating these humble materials to temperatures that transform them into something translucent and strange. Molten glass glows like captured sunlight. It can be blown into delicate vessels, cast into window panes, shaped into beads and ornaments. The glass found in Lutetian graves shows remarkable variety, from crude greenish bottles to fine clear vessels that must have graced wealthy tables. The homes themselves are modest affairs compared to the stone villas of the truly wealthy. Most residents live in structures of timber and clay, wattle and daub walls plastered and sometimes painted, thatched or tiled roofs keeping out the rain. The floors might be packed earth or, in more prosperous households, simple mosaic or tile. Furniture is sparse by our standards. Benches and tables, storage chests, perhaps a bed frame strung with rope or leather strips. Light comes from oil lamps or candles, their flickering illumination creating pools of warmth in the darkness. But it is not the individual structures that matter most. It is the collective life they housed, the intricate web of relationships and dependencies that made a city function. The boatmen who worked the Seine formed their own guild, a professional association that gave them both identity and influence. We know this because they left behind a remarkable artifact, the so-called Pillar of the Boatman, a monument erected sometime in the early 1st century of our era, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. This pillar is extraordinary not for its size, but for what it reveals about the self-image and civic pride of Lutetia's working class. The boatmen, the Naughty Parisiasi as they called themselves, commissioned a stone monument honouring both Roman and Celtic deities. Jupiter appears alongside Isis, Tarvos Trigoranus, alongside other gods of the old Gallic pantheon. The very existence of this monument tells us that the boatmen were wealthy enough, organised enough, and confident enough to make such a public statement of their importance to the city. And they were important. Everything that moved in and out of Lutetia moved on water. Timber from the great forests upriver, grain and wine and oil, trade goods from distant provinces, building stone, people themselves. The river was the city's highway, and the boatmen were its masters. They knew every current and sandbar, every dock and landing. They worked in all weather, poling their flat-bottomed vessels through summer heat and winter ice, their knowledge passed down through generations. Other guilds and associations doubtless existed, though their monuments have not survived or have not yet been found. Potters and metalworkers, builders and merchants, each craft forming its own community within the larger whole. In the graves of these workers, archaeologists find the tools of their trades buried alongside them, potters' tools, metalworkers' implements, merchants' scales and weights. Even in death, identity was bound to labour. The social hierarchy of Lutetia was complex, as it was in all Roman cities. At the top stood the wealthy, those who owned land and ships and workshops, who held civic office and commissioned public monuments. Below them came the skilled craftsmen, the respectable middle classes who formed guilds and raised families and contributed to the city's economy. Further down were the labourers, the hired hands, the enslaved workers who formed the bottom tier of urban life. We know less about these latter groups, for they left fewer traces, but they were there, essential to the functioning of the whole. The material culture recovered from Lutetia's archaeological layers paints a picture of a modest but functional urban centre, neither desperately poor nor ostentatiously wealthy. The ceramics are well made but not luxurious. The glass is present but not abundant. The metalwork is competent but not spectacular. This was a city of practical people engaged in practical work, building lives within the framework of Roman rule while maintaining threads of older identity. If you wish to understand how Lutetia sustained itself, how it fed its people and built its monuments and maintained its place within the vast machinery of Roman Gaul, you must first understand the river. The Seine was not merely a geographical feature, not simply water flowing past stone and timber. It was the city's lifeline, its highway, its reason for existence. Everything that made Lutetia possible moved upon those waters. Stand on the riverbank in the early morning, when mist still clings to the surface and the light is soft and grey. Already the river is alive with movement. Flat-bottomed boats pole upstream against the current, their crews calling to one another in voices that carry across the water. Other vessels drift downstream, riding the flow, their cargo, covered with oiled cloth against the weather. The river speaks its own language, a vocabulary of currents and eddies, of seasonal rises and falls, of passages safe and passages treacherous. The boatmen know this language as intimately as they know their own names. These boatmen, the naughty Parisiasi, formed the backbone of Lutetia's economy. They were not merely labourers but skilled professionals, organised into a guild that gave them both identity and power. We have already encountered their monument, that remarkable pillar honouring gods both Roman and Celtic, but the significance of that artefact extends beyond mere religious devotion. It speaks to wealth, to organisation, to civic confidence. These were men who commanded resources, who moved the goods that sustained the city, who knew their worth and were not afraid to proclaim it. The boats themselves were simple but effective vessels, designed not for open sea but for the specific demands of river navigation. Flat bottoms allowed them to traverse shallow waters and approach muddy banks. Square sails could catch favourable winds, but more often the work was done by muscle and pole, by the rhythm of men pushing against the riverbed, moving cargo foot by foot against the current. Loading and unloading happened at wooden wharves along the banks, places where the distinction between land and water blurred into a muddy frontier of commerce. What moved on these waters? Timber, first and foremost. The forests that surrounded Lutetia were vast, ancient woodlands of oak and beech, ash and elm. These trees represented wealth in its most fundamental form, building material. Every structure in the city required wood. The frames of houses, the beams that supported roofs, the scaffolding for stone construction, the fuel for countless hearths and forges and kilns. Timber had to be harvested, limbed, floated downriver or hauled to the water's edge, then transported to the city. It was heavy, awkward, essential work. The lumber trade connected Lutetia to its hinterland, to the villages and settlements upriver where men with axes felled trees and prepared logs for transport. When the river ran high in spring, great rafts of timber would appear, entire forests in motion, guided by crews who lived for days or weeks aboard their floating cargo. The smell of fresh-cut wood would announce their arrival before they came into view. At the city's docks, merchants and builders would inspect the timber, negotiating prices, arranging for transport to construction sites, or to the workshops where wood would be shaped into doors and shutters, furniture and tools, the thousand wooden necessities of urban life. But timber was only one current in the larger flow of trade. Grain moved on the river, wheat and barley from agricultural regions upstream, destined for the city's bakeries and granaries. Wine travelled in amphorae, those distinctive clay vessels with their narrow necks and pointed bases, designed to be packed tightly, in a ship's hold or stacked efficiently in a warehouse. Oil moved in similar containers, olive oil from the south, that golden liquid so central to Roman cooking and lighting and hygiene. Building stone, though much of it was quarried locally, also came by water when necessary, massive blocks that required exceptional care in loading and transport. The river connected Lutetia not only to its immediate region, but to the wider world of Roman Gaul. Downstream, the Seine flowed toward the sea, toward ports that link the Atlantic coast to Britain and beyond. Upstream, tributaries reached toward other river systems, toward the Rhine and the roads that led to Rome itself. Lutetia sat within a web of waterways and roads, a network that bound the empire together. Goods that began their journey in distant provinces could, through a series of transfers and transshipments, eventually arrive at these docks on the Seine. This integration into larger trade networks brought not only material goods but ideas, styles, technologies. A merchant who had travelled to Lyon or Trier would return with stories of other cities, other ways of doing things. A craftsman might encounter a new technique demonstrated by a visiting artisan. The flow of people and goods ensured that Lutetia, despite its modest size, was not isolated but connected, aware of currents moving through the wider Roman world. The economics of all this was straightforward in principle but complex in practice. The boatmen charged fees for transport, calculated by weight and distance. Merchants bought low and sold high, their profit the difference between what they paid at one end of the river and what they could command at the other. Taxes were levied at various points, revenue flowing into civic coffers or into the hands of imperial officials. The city itself depended on this commercial activity for its survival. Without the constant flow of food and materials, without the economic vitality that trade generated, Lutetia could not sustain its population or maintain its infrastructure. There was risk, of course. Rivers flood, boats sink, cargo is damaged or lost. Pirates, though less common on interior waters than at sea, were not unknown. Accidents happened, poles slipped, men fell overboard. The river could give and the river could take away. But the system persisted because it worked, because it met real needs, because the alternatives were worse or non-existent. On any given day, if you stood by the water's edge, you could read the city's pulse in the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Morning would bring the fishing boats, their nets full or empty depending on fortune. Midday saw the heavy cargo vessels, timber and stone and amphora. Evening brought smaller craft, ferrying passengers across the river or upstream to villages beyond the city. And through it all, the boatmen worked, their bodies bent to poles or oars, their voices raised in work songs or casual conversation, their labour the hidden, foundation upon which everything else rested. To understand Lutetia, to truly comprehend what held the city together beyond walls and markets and the flow of the river, you must understand belief. Religion in the Roman world was not a private matter of personal conviction, but a public act, a communal performance that bound people together through shared ritual and shared gods. In Lutetia, this religious life had a particular texture, a distinctive character born from the meeting of two worlds, the Celtic traditions of the Parisiae and the Roman pantheon that arrived with conquest. The gods themselves became a kind of negotiation, a spiritual compromise that reflected the larger political and cultural accommodation. When you walk through the city's sacred spaces, you encountered deities who had learned to coexist, whose identities sometimes merged and blended in ways that would have seemed strange to a visitor from Rome or from the old Celtic heartlands. This was not the pure religion of either tradition, but something new, something created in the encounter between them. Consider again that pillar erected by the boatmen, that monument we have already encountered in its civic and economic dimensions. Look more closely now at the gods it honours. Jupiter appears there, the chief deity of the Roman pantheon, lord of ski and thunder. His presence is expected, natural, the acknowledgement of imperial power and Roman order. But carved into the same stone, sharing the same sacred space, you find Esus, a Celtic god whose name the Romans recorded, but whose exact nature remains shadowy to us. You find Tarvus Trigoranus, the bull with 3 cranes, a figure from Celtic tradition whose meaning was already ancient when the stone was carved. This pillar is not an anomaly, but a window into how religion actually functioned in places like Lutetia. The boatmen who commissioned it were not making a political statement so much as acknowledging the reality of their world. They lived under Roman rule, participated in Roman civic life, but they had not forgotten the gods of their ancestors. Why choose between traditions when both could be honoured? Why abandon one set of deities when embracing another? The stone itself becomes a kind of theological argument. proposing that the divine world was large enough to contain multitudes. Walk with me now toward one of the city's temples. The exact locations and dedications remain uncertain, buried beneath later construction, or lost to the slow erosion of memory, but we know such spaces existed. Every Roman city had its sacred architecture, its places set apart for communion with the divine. In Lutetia, these temples would have been modest affairs compared to the grand structures of Rome or even Lyon, but they would have followed the same basic pattern. A rectangular building, a columned portico, an inner sanctum where the cult statue stood, an altar outside where sacrifices were made. Approach the temple on a festival day, when the city gathers for public worship. The air is thick with incense, that distinctive sharp sweet smoke that rises from burning resins and fragrant woods. You smell the blood of sacrifice, the copper tang mingling with smoke and flowers. The priests move with practiced precision, their white togas bright in the morning sun, their hands performing gestures refined over centuries. They speak the traditional prayers in Latin, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that connect this moment to countless other moments in countless other cities across the empire. But listen more carefully. Beneath the Latin, woven through it, you might catch phrases in the old Gallic tongue, invocations to gods whose names did not travel easily into Roman mouths. The crowd gathered here is not purely Roman nor purely Gallic, but both, and neither, a population whose grandparents remembered a different world, but whose children speak Latin as naturally as breathing. Their worship reflects this liminality, this existence between cultures. The calendar itself became a kind of religious compromise. Roman festivals marking the emperor's birthday or the founding of Rome were observed alongside older Celtic celebrations tied to the agricultural year, to the turning of seasons, to the movement of sun and moon through ancient patterns. Spring brought rites of renewal, summer brought harvest blessings, autumn turned toward the darkness, toward the thinning of the veil between worlds, toward propitiation of the dead. Winter solstice marked the sun's return, the promise that light would not fail forever. In homes throughout the city, smaller shrines maintained the connection between family and divine. Loraria, those household altars dedicated to the protective spirits of hearth and home, occupied corners of rooms or niches in walls. Here the head of each household would make daily offerings, a bit of food, a splash of wine, a handful of incense. These were not grand gestures but quiet acknowledgements, the domestic equivalent of the public ceremonies at the temples. The gods were not distant abstractions but present participants in daily life, requiring attention and offering protection in return. The dead too demanded respect and remembrance. The necropoleis that ring the city, those carefully maintained cities of the dead, were not mere disposal sites, but sacred spaces where the living maintained connection with those who had gone before. Families would visit graves on appointed days, bringing food and drink to share with the departed. The boundary between life and death was understood to be permeable, a threshold rather than an absolute divide. The dead still had power, still required propitiation, still watched over their descendants with approval or displeasure. This spiritual world was not a matter of dogma or theology in the way we might understand such terms. There were no sacred texts, no fixed orthodoxies, no heresy trials. Religion was practice, performance, the doing of prescribed actions at prescribed times. You honoured the gods not by believing particular things about them, but by performing the proper rituals, by maintaining the contract between human and divine through offering and prayer. Piety was measured not in faith, but in action, in the careful observance of tradition and obligation. The blending of Celtic and Roman religious traditions in Lutetia was not always smooth or complete. Undoubtedly there were tensions, moments when the accommodation felt forced or incomplete. But the very existence of monuments like the Boatman's Pillar suggests a genuine synthesis, a working solution to the problem of how to honour multiple traditions within a single community. The gods themselves seemed willing to share space, to accept worship from people who spoke different languages and carried different histories, but who all, in the end, sought the same things: protection, prosperity, the favour of forces larger than themselves. There comes a moment in the life of any city when you begin to notice the hairline cracks, the subtle signs that all is not quite as solid as it appears. Lutetia, at its height, during those prosperous decades of the 1st and 2nd centuries, seemed secure enough. The forum bustled with commerce, the baths steamed with heated water, The amphitheatre filled with crowds on festival days, but if you looked more carefully, if you studied the underlying systems rather than the surface prosperity, you might have detected certain vulnerabilities, certain dependencies that made the whole structure more fragile than it first appeared. Consider the amphitheatre itself, that grand monument to civic ambition that still speaks to us across the centuries. Here was a structure designed to hold perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 spectators, a vast crowd by any measure. Yet the best estimates we have for Lutetia's population suggest a city of only 5,000 to 8,000 souls at its peak. This is a curious disproportion. Why build an amphitheatre that could accommodate nearly twice your entire population? Several explanations present themselves. Perhaps the structure was intended to serve not merely the city itself, but the surrounding region, drawing crowds from the villages and settlements scattered along the Seine and its tributaries. Festival days might have seen the countryside emptying into the city, rural families making the journey to witness spectacles they could not see at home. In this reading, the amphitheatre represents not overreach but regional ambition, Lutetia positioning itself as a centre for a larger territory. Or perhaps the very building of such a monument reflects a kind of optimism, a belief in future growth that never quite materialised. Cities throughout the empire built ambitiously, each trying to demonstrate its importance through stone and mortar. An impressive amphitheatre announced status, attracted attention, competed for imperial favour and economic opportunity. But infrastructure built for a population that never arrives becomes a burden, a maintenance obligation draining resources that might be better spent elsewhere. There is another possibility, less comfortable to contemplate. The amphitheatre might represent a moment of economic overextension, a spending of resources the city could not truly afford, financed perhaps by debt, or by expectations of future revenue that proved unrealistic. We know this pattern from other times and places, the grand project that strains the budget, the monument that becomes a millstone. Turn your attention now to the aqueduct, that remarkable feat of engineering that brought fresh water from distant springs to feed the city's baths and fountains. This was sophisticated infrastructure, expensive to build and maintain. Stone channels and arched bridges carried water across miles of landscape, maintaining a precise gradient that allowed gravity to do the work of transport. Clay pipes distributed the flow throughout the city. The system required constant oversight, regular repairs, protection against damage and theft. The very existence of this aqueduct tells us something important about Lutetia's relationship with its environment. The Seine flowed right through the city, an apparently limitless source of water. Yet the Romans chose not to rely on the river for their baths and public fountains. Why? Because river water, particularly in a settlement where boats came and went and waste inevitably found its way into the current, was not considered sufficiently clean for bathing. The Romans were fastidious about such matters. Public health depended on clean water, and clean water required infrastructure, but infrastructure creates dependency. Once you have built an aqueduct and designed your city around the assumption of piped water, you become vulnerable to anything that disrupts that system. A broken channel, a damaged bridge, an enemy force that targets your water supply, or simply the gradual decay that comes when maintenance becomes too expensive, or when the labour and expertise to perform repairs becomes scarce. The more sophisticated your infrastructure, the more ways it can fail. The economic foundations of the city, too, rested on assumptions that might not hold indefinitely. The timber trade depended on vast forests that could be harvested and transported via river. But forests are not infinite resources. Trees that are cut down must be given time to regrow, or the supply dwindles and prices rise. We have no evidence of serious deforestation around Lutetia in this period, but the pattern was not unknown elsewhere in the empire. The demand for timber was constant and heavy. Every new building, every repair, every hearth fire represented trees falling somewhere in the hinterland. The river trade itself, that steady flow of boats and cargo that animated the city's economy, depended on relationships and connections that extended far beyond Lutetia's immediate control. A disruption in trade routes upstream or downstream, political instability in neighbouring territories, the emergence of competing centres of commerce, any of these could impact the flow of goods and the prosperity that flow generated. Lutetia was plugged into larger systems, and those systems were not always stable. The wider Roman world, too, showed signs of strain that perceptive observers might have noticed. The empire at its height in the 2nd century seemed invincible, eternal, but it was in fact a complex human construct held together by military force, administrative competence, and economic integration. Any or all of these could weaken. Borders that seemed secure could become porous. Tax revenues that seemed reliable could decline. The very peace that allowed trade to flourish depended on the empire's ability to maintain order across vast distances. None of this was immediately catastrophic. Lutetia, in the early 2nd century, was not a city in crisis. But beneath the surface, beneath the routines of daily life and the confidence of civic monuments, there existed certain structural vulnerabilities, certain dependencies and assumptions that might, under the wrong circumstances, become serious problems. The amphitheatre stood as a symbol of ambition that perhaps exceeded actual need. The aqueduct represented technological achievement, but also a point of potential failure. The economic vitality of the city rested on systems and relationships it did not fully control. If you had asked a resident of Lutetia in those prosperous decades whether they worried about such things, they likely would have shrugged. The city had stood for generations. The empire seemed eternal. Tomorrow would be much like today. This is how people think, how they must think, in order to go about their daily lives without paralysis. But history, patient and implacable, was already preparing its lessons about fragility and impermanence, about the distance between appearance and underlying reality. The 3rd century brought a change in the weather, though not in any way a meteorologist would recognize. This was a shift in the climate of history itself, a turning of conditions that had seemed stable into something more uncertain, more dangerous. The long Roman peace that had allowed cities like Lutetia to prosper, that had protected trade routes and permitted the movement of goods and people across vast distances, began to fray at the edges. The borders, once secure, became permeable, and what came through those borders carried consequences that would reshape the city. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, peoples the Romans knew collectively as barbarians, began to move. The reasons were complex, born from pressures further east, from climate fluctuations affecting agriculture, from political dynamics within and between tribal confederations. But the effect, from the perspective of places like Lutetia, was a series of raids and incursions that disrupted the order upon which everything depended. Trade routes became dangerous. Travellers risked ambush. The confident assumption that tomorrow would be peaceful began to waver. We should be careful here not to imagine a single dramatic invasion, a specific day when barbarian hordes appeared at the gates. That is not how this unfolded. Rather, imagine a situation that deteriorates gradually, where the interval between attacks grows shorter, where the security once taken for granted becomes increasingly uncertain. Perhaps for years nothing happens. Then a raid upstream disrupts river traffic for weeks. Then rumours of larger movements, of whole peoples on the move. Then another raid, closer this time. The threats become more frequent, more difficult to dismiss. In response to this growing insecurity, the people of Lutetia made a choice. They began to abandon the left bank, that area on the southern side of the Seine where so much of the Roman city had been built. The Forum on its hill, the great baths, the amphitheatre, the residential quarters spreading across the slopes of what would later be called Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, all of this began to empty. Families gathered their portable possessions and moved to more defensible ground. The destination was the Ile de la Cité, that island in the middle of the Seine where, perhaps, the original Gallic settlement had stood centuries before. This retreat to the island made strategic sense. Water provided a natural barrier. The island was small enough to defend with limited forces. Bridges could be destroyed or guarded. The river itself became a moat. But this practical logic came at enormous cost. Everything that had been built on the left bank over 2 centuries, all that stone and timber and accumulated infrastructure, was being left behind. Not destroyed in a single catastrophic moment, but simply abandoned, left to silence and slow decay. Picture the Forum in its final years of occupation. Once it had bustled with merchants and officials, with citizens conducting business and slaves running errands. Now the shops begin to close, the crowds thin. Eventually someone locks a door for the last time and does not return. The stone porticos, so carefully constructed, stand empty. Rain falls through roofs that no longer merit repair. Weeds push through paving stones. The space that had been the civic heart of Roman Lutetia becomes a ghost of itself, haunted not by spirits, but by the memory of vanished purpose. The baths, too, fall silent. Without maintenance, the complex system that heated water and moved it through various chambers breaks down. The aqueduct that fed them, that remarkable feat of engineering we considered earlier, loses its reason for existence. Why maintain expensive infrastructure to supply buildings no one uses? The flow of water slows, then stops. The channels begin to deteriorate. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to maintain such systems might be lost entirely. The amphitheatre, that monument to civic ambition, stands empty now. No crowds gather on its stone benches. No spectacles unfold on its sandy floor. It becomes a quarry of sorts, its stones too valuable to leave unused. People returning to salvage building materials for new construction on the island carry away the cut stone block by block. The structure that had defined the skyline begins to diminish, to sink back toward the earth from which it had been raised. This process of abandonment was not instantaneous, but extended across decades of the 3rd century. Some families left early, sensing danger before it fully manifested. Others lingered, reluctant to abandon homes and workshops, waiting perhaps for conditions to improve. Some areas of the left bank emptied completely, while others maintained sparse occupation for years longer. The retreat was uneven, hesitant, marked by false starts and temporary returns. The economic consequences were severe. A city that contracts loses tax base, loses labour force, loses the economic complexity that comes from having multiple specialised craftsmen and merchants in close proximity. Trade that had flowed through Lutetia might now bypass it, seeking safer routes or more stable markets. The guild of boatmen that had been so proud, so prosperous, found their business diminishing. Fewer goods moved on the river. Fewer customers needed their services. On the island, the population density increased even as the overall population declined. Houses pressed together. Resources became strained. The elegant urban planning of the Roman city gave way to a more cramped, improvised arrangement. Wooden buildings replaced stone where new construction was necessary. The aesthetic, the very feel of the city changed from spacious Roman order to something more medieval, more organic, more defensive. The psychological impact of this contraction must have been profound. For residents who remembered the city at its height, who had lived through the prosperous decades, this retreat represented a fundamental failure. The promise of Roman civilization, the assumption of ever-increasing prosperity and security, had been revealed as contingent, fragile, breakable. The monuments they were abandoning stood as reproaches, reminders of what had been lost, of a confidence that could no longer be sustained. While the physical city contracted, while stone buildings were abandoned and the population retreated to the island, another transformation was taking place, quieter but no less profound. The spiritual landscape of Lutetia was shifting, the old religious certainties giving way to something new. This was not a sudden rupture, not a moment of dramatic conversion, but a slow reorientation that unfolded across generations, barely visible to those living through it, but unmistakable when viewed from sufficient distance. The old gods, those deities who had presided over the city's public and private life for centuries, were losing their hold. The temples fell into disuse not because of persecution or prohibition, but simply because fewer people came to offer sacrifice. The elaborate public ceremonies that had once drawn crowds grew smaller, more perfunctory, performed perhaps out of habit or civic obligation, rather than genuine devotion. The incense still rose from altar fires, but the smoke seemed to dissipate more quickly, as if the gods themselves were withdrawing, losing interest in human affairs. Several factors contributed to this fading of the old religious order. The physical abandonment of the left bank meant the abandonment of sacred spaces. Temples that had stood in neighbourhoods now empty lost their congregations. Maintenance became impossible. Roofs failed, walls cracked, sanctuaries that had been carefully tended for generations began their slow return to ruin. A religion that expresses itself through public ritual and communal gathering cannot easily survive the dissolution of the community it served. There was a deeper problem as well. The old gods had been guarantors of prosperity and security. You honoured Jupiter and Mars, you performed the prescribed sacrifices and prayers, and in return you expected protection, victory, abundance. But when security fails, when prosperity evaporates, when the very empire that had seemed eternal begins to fragment, the contract between humans and gods appears broken. Why continue to honour deities who have not fulfilled their side of the bargain? This is not theology, but simple accounting, the weighing of offerings made against benefits received. Into this spiritual vacuum came something else, something that had been present in the Roman world for centuries but had remained, in places like Lutetia, a minority faith, often suspected, sometimes persecuted, generally marginal. Christianity, with its very different assumptions and promises, began to take root more firmly. The exact timeline is uncertain, obscured by the same lack of detailed records that frustrates our understanding of so much about late Roman Lutetia. But by the 4th century, perhaps earlier, there were Christians in the city. Small communities of believers who gathered in private homes, who shared a sacred meal in memory of their executed god, who read texts that spoke of kingdoms not of this world. The appeal of Christianity in troubled times is not difficult to understand. Where the old gods offered prosperity in exchange for proper ritual, Christianity offered meaning in suffering, dignity in poverty, hope beyond the grave. You did not need wealth to be Christian. You did not need power or status. The faith spoke to slaves and free persons alike, promised that the hierarchies of this world would be overturned in the world to come. For people watching their city contract, watching their security evaporate, watching the confident structures of Roman civilization crack and crumble, this message carried a particular resonance. The new faith also brought new forms of community. Christian congregations cared for their members in practical ways, pooling resources to help the poor, visiting the sick, providing burial for the dead. In a city where traditional civic structures were failing, where the old certainties no longer held, these communities offered belonging and mutual support. You were not alone in your struggle. You were part of a body of believers, brothers and sisters in faith who would not abandon you. Historical tradition speaks of early bishops in Paris, though the details are murky, layered with later legend and pious invention. St. Denis supposedly martyred in the 3rd century, his cult growing in later ages. These stories may preserve kernels of historical truth, or they may be entirely mythological. What matters more than individual names is the pattern they suggest: the gradual establishment of Christian hierarchy, the organization of believers into structured communities under episcopal leadership, the creation of new religious institutions to replace those that were fading. The archaeological evidence, fragmentary as it is, hints at this transformation. Burial practices begin to change. The old necropoleis that ring the city show, in their latest layers, graves oriented differently, lacking the grave goods that had traditionally accompanied the dead into the afterlife. Christian burial was simpler, the body laid out with its head to the west, awaiting resurrection. No need for food and drink, no need for the possessions of earthly life. The dead would wake in a new world where such things no longer mattered. The physical fabric of the city itself bears witness to this spiritual reorientation. When defensive walls were built on the island, when the contracted population needed fortifications to protect their refuge, they used whatever materials came to hand. This included stone quarried from the abandoned structures on the left bank. Blocks that had once formed temple walls, that had been carved and fitted to honour Jupiter or Mars or the old Celtic deities, were now repurposed for purely practical ends. Pagan altars became foundation stones. Sanctified spaces were dismantled without ceremony, their materials recycled into walls that would protect a population increasingly Christian in its orientation. There is something almost casually ruthless about this reuse of sacred stone for secular purposes. It suggests that by the time these walls were built, the old religious sensibilities had weakened to the point where such desecration no longer troubled the conscience. The stones were just stones now, their former meaning drained away, their utility all that remained. This is how religions die, not in dramatic confrontation but in quiet irrelevance, in the simple decision that this temple wall will serve better as fortification, that this altar stone makes good building material. Names matter. They are not mere labels but containers of identity, markers of how a people understand themselves and their place in the world, and so it is significant, deeply so, that sometime during these troubled centuries, the city ceased to be called Lutetia and became instead known simply as Parisii, the place of the Parisiae, eventually shortened and softened into Paris. This linguistic shift reflects a larger transformation, a fundamental reorientation of what the city was and what it meant to live there. The name Lutetia had been Roman. imposed or adopted during that period of conquest and integration when the Celtic settlement was reorganised according to Roman principles. It had carried associations with mud and marshland, perhaps, an acknowledgement of the swampy origins of the site, but it had also been a Roman name for a Roman city. To call yourself a resident of Lutetia was to claim a place within the Roman world, to identify with an empire and a civilization that seemed, for a time, both universal and eternal. But that Roman identity was fraying now, losing coherence as the structures that had sustained it decayed or disappeared. The Forum stood empty. The baths were silent. The amphitheatre crumbled into its own foundations. The aqueduct no longer flowed. The very physical manifestations of Romanness were becoming ruins, their functions forgotten, their purposes obsolete. And as these structures faded, so too did the identity they had embodied. The adoption of the name Parisii, or rather the return to it, represented a reaching back toward older roots, toward a tribal identity that predated Rome. The Parisii had been here before the legions came, had lived along these riverbanks for centuries before Latin was spoken on these streets. In times of uncertainty, when the new order fails, people often turn toward the old, seeking anchors in tradition, in blood, in connections that run deeper than political arrangements. The city was remembering what it had been before it became Roman, or perhaps inventing a memory that served present needs. This was not a rejection of everything Rome had represented, not a conscious decision to abandon Roman ways. Rather, it was an adaptation to new circumstances, a recognition that the empire which had given the city its Roman character was no longer the same entity, no longer capable of providing the security and prosperity that had once justified loyalty and identity. The empire itself was fragmenting, breaking apart under pressures both internal and external. Local identities reasserted themselves in the gaps left by imperial retreat. The physical transformation of the city mirrored this shift in identity. The island, that defensible refuge to which the population had retreated, became the new centre of gravity. Here walls were built, constructed from stones cannibalized from the abandoned structures across the river. It is worth pausing to consider what this meant, this systematic dismantling of the Roman city to fortify its shrunken successor. Every block carried from the Forum or the baths to be set into a defensive wall represented a decision about priorities, about what mattered now versus what had mattered before. The new walls enclosed a much smaller space than Roman Lutetia had occupied. The city had contracted not merely in population but in ambition, in its sense of what was possible or desirable. The grand public monuments, the theatres and baths and forums that announced civic pride and competed for status within the Roman hierarchy, these were luxuries that no longer made sense. What mattered now was survival, defence, the maintenance of community on a more modest scale. Yet this contraction, this transformation, was not experienced as tragedy by all who lived through it. For many, perhaps most, daily life continued in its essential patterns. You still woke and worked and ate and slept. You still raised children, buried the dead, worried about the harvest and the weather, and the countless small concerns that fill human days. The Forum might be abandoned, but you still needed bread. The baths might be ruins, but you still bathed, if more simply. The amphitheatre might stand empty, but you still found ways to mark festivals and gather with neighbours. The city's role in the larger world was changing too. Under Roman rule, Lutetia had been a relatively minor urban centre, one node among many in a vast network of cities and roads and trade routes. Now, as that network fragmented, as the roads became less safe and trade less reliable, local importance could grow even as connection to distant centres weakened. Paris, as we may now begin to call it, was becoming less Roman and more Frankish, aligning itself with new powers, new dynasties, new political arrangements that were emerging from the wreckage of imperial order. The Merovingian kings, those Frankish rulers who were carving kingdoms from former Roman territories, recognized the strategic value of the island city. It controlled river crossings. It occupied a defensible position. It had history and name recognition, qualities that mattered when establishing legitimacy. And so, Paris found itself in time transformed from a minor Roman town into something more significant under Frankish rule, eventually becoming a capital, a seat of power for kingdoms that would shape the future of what we now call France. This represents not collapse but metamorphosis, not death but transformation. The Roman city died, yes, but something else was born from its remains. using its stones, occupying its site, drawing on its history, even as it created new traditions and new identities. This is how cities actually work across deep time. They are not static entities that either persist unchanged or vanish completely. They are living things that adapt, transform, reinvent themselves in response to changing circumstances. The people who watched these transformations, who lived through the abandonment of the left bank and the retreat to the island, who saw Roman buildings become quarries and pagan temples become Christian churches, these people were witnessing the end of one world and the beginning of another. They could not possibly know, that the name Paris would endure for more than 1,500 years, that the city would eventually far outgrow its Roman predecessor, that the island refuge would become the heart of one of the world's great capitals. There is a particular way that cities disappear. Not in earthquake or fire, not in dramatic catastrophe that leaves clear before and after, but slowly, incrementally, through 1,000 small decisions about what to preserve and what to abandon, what to maintain, and what to cannibalize. This is how Roman Lutetia vanished, not destroyed, but gradually erased, written over like a palimpsest where each new layer obscures what came before. Picture the Forum on the hill, that civic heart we have already visited in imagination. For years after its abandonment, perhaps decades, the structure stood essentially intact. Roofs eventually failed, exposing interior spaces to rain and snow. Wooden elements rotted. Plaster fell from walls, but the stone remained, the fundamental skeleton of the place, still recognizable as what it had been. A visitor returning after long absence might feel sadness at the decay, but would still understand the space, still read its original purpose in the arrangement of its parts. But stone is valuable. Cut stone, shaped and fitted, represents labour and skill. It can be reused, and so people came, generation by generation, to harvest the Forum the way you might harvest a field. A wall section there, suitable for a foundation. A column base, perfect for repurposing. Paving stones, ideal for a new building. Each removal was rational, practical, economical. Why quarry fresh stone when perfectly good stone stands unused? No malice in this, no vandalism, simply the logic of scarcity and need. The same process repeated itself across the abandoned left bank. The great baths with their vaulted chambers and heated floors, their complex systems of channels and furnaces, these too became quarries. The vaults collapsed eventually, their weight no longer properly supported once key stones were removed. The collapse itself made extraction easier, breaking large structures into movable pieces. The hypocaust floors, those ingenious hollow spaces through which hot air had once circulated, filled with debris. The building slowly ceased to be architecture and became instead geology, a stratum of human construction settling back toward Earth. The amphitheatre suffered perhaps the most thorough dismantling. Its very size, its thousands of dressed stones fitted together in that elegant curve, made it the richest quarry of all. The process took time, perhaps centuries, but it was systematic. The upper tiers vanished first, easiest to reach, easiest to cart away. The work moved downward, ring by ring, until only the foundations remained, and eventually even those were plundered wherever. They could be reached without excessive effort. New buildings rose on the island in the contracted city where people actually lived. Some of these buildings incorporated Roman stone, blocks that had once formed public monuments now serving private purposes. A column that had graced the Forum might become part of a defensive wall. An altar stone from a temple might form the threshold of a house. The stones remembered nothing, carried no protest at their demotion. They served as they were commanded to serve, but the repurposing of stone was only the most visible form of erasure. More insidiously, new construction simply buried the old. Medieval Paris grew upward and outward from the island refuge. Buildings rose on the left bank again, eventually, but they rose atop the ruins of what had been there before. Streets followed new patterns, responding to medieval needs and medieval logic rather than Roman planning. The old grid, that rational cardo and decumanus that had organized space according to classical principles, disappeared beneath a more organic tangle of lanes and alleys. With each generation, the collective memory of what the Roman city had been grew dimmer. The grandparents who remembered the Forum in use died. Their children, who had seen it standing empty, died in turn. Their grandchildren knew only that there had once been something there, something old, something no longer important, Eventually, even that vague awareness faded. The stones underfoot became just stones, the fragments of wall just fragments, disconnected from any larger story. This forgetting was aided by the simple accumulation of soil and debris. Cities generate waste constantly. Garbage piles up. Broken pottery, food scraps, ashes from fires, all of it has to go somewhere. In medieval times, much of it simply stayed where it fell, compressed by foot traffic, building up in layers that raised the street level inch by inch, year by year. Construction debris from demolished buildings added to the accumulation. Flood deposits from the Seine contributed silt and mud. The ground level rose. What had once been at street level sank below it. Doorways became cellars. First floors became basements. Roman structures that had stood proudly visible gradually descended into darkness, buried by the simple processes of urban accretion. To walk the streets of medieval Paris was to walk 15 or 20 feet above Roman Lutetia, separated from it not by a great gulf but by centuries of accumulated debris and new construction, a thin but impenetrable barrier of historical sediment. The amphitheatre, even in its ruined and plundered state, probably remained partially visible for centuries. Its foundations were too massive to remove entirely, its footprint too large to be completely obscured. But as buildings crowded around it, as gardens and streets overlaid its outline, as the very memory of what it had been evaporated from popular knowledge, it ceased to register as a distinct place. It became a depression in the ground, perhaps, or a particularly rocky section of garden, its Roman identity completely lost. By the time Paris emerged as a medieval capital, by the time the city had grown into a place that once again mattered in the wider world, Lutetia had become invisible, not gone, but hidden, sleeping beneath the stones and soil of the city that had replaced it. The residents of medieval Paris had no idea that they walked over forums and baths, that their cellars sometimes penetrated into Roman structures, that the seemingly natural topography of their city concealed the ghosts of another civilization entirely. This is perhaps the most profound form of loss, not destruction, but forgetting. Not the removal of evidence, but the loss of the ability to read that evidence. The stones remained, but no one remembered what they had been. The spaces persisted, but no one could see them. For centuries the Roman city slept beneath modern Paris, invisible and forgotten. But sleeping is not the same as dead. The stones remained where they had fallen or been buried. The structures, though collapsed or dismantled, left their traces in the soil, and eventually, inevitably, the work of modern life began to disturb that long slumber, to break through the layers of accumulated history and encounter what lay beneath. The rediscovery of Roman Lutetia was not a single moment of revelation, but a series of encounters spanning decades, even centuries. Each excavation for a new building, each construction project that required digging deep foundations, risked breaking through into older strata. Sometimes the workers encountered worked stone, blocks too precisely cut to be natural, too regular to be accident. Sometimes cellars opened onto vaulted chambers that clearly predated the structure above. These discoveries were often puzzling, rarely understood for what they represented. The systematic archaeology of Lutetia began properly in the 19th century, that age of progress and construction, when Paris was being dramatically remade. Baron Haussmann's renovation of the city, that vast program of demolition and rebuilding that created the Paris of wide boulevards and uniform facades, generated countless opportunities for archaeological discovery. When you tear down medieval buildings and dig deep foundations for modern ones, you inevitably encounter the past. The most dramatic rediscovery came in the 1860s. Workers were excavating for a tram depot on the left bank, on a site called Arène de Lutèce, a name that preserved in corrupted form the memory of something that had once been there. As the labourers dug, they encountered stone, not scattered fragments, but massive curved walls, precisely fitted blocks arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate architecture. Further excavation revealed more. Tiers of seating carved into the hillside, a great oval space, unmistakably an amphitheatre. This was not a small structure. This was the lost arena of Roman Lutetia, capable of holding thousands of spectators, its very existence forgotten for more than a millennium. The stones that had been systematically plundered over centuries, the structure that had slowly sunk beneath rising ground levels and accumulating debris, was being exposed again to daylight and air. The workmen must have stood in wonder, trying to comprehend what they had found, what their routine excavation had accidentally revealed. But the immediate response was not preservation. This was a construction site. The tram depot needed to be built. The amphitheatre, however remarkable, was in the way. Plans moved forward to complete the destruction that centuries had begun, to remove what remained of the structure and continue with modern development. The stones of Roman Lutetia, having survived so much, faced extinction in the name of progress. What saved the amphitheatre was an outcry led by prominent cultural figures, most notably Victor Hugo, that celebrated writer whose voice carried weight in French society. Hugo and others argued passionately for preservation, for the recognition that these ancient stones represented something valuable, something that should not be casually destroyed for the sake of a tram depot. The campaign succeeded. The amphitheatre was spared, protected as a historic monument, eventually restored and opened to the public as a park, a place where modern Parisians could walk amid the ruins of their Roman predecessor. The baths received kinder treatment, perhaps because their remains were already partially visible, already recognised as something significant. The structure that would later house the Musée de Cluny, that museum of medieval art, was built in the 15th century, deliberately incorporating the Roman bath ruins, using them as foundations and cellars. The medieval builders recognised that they were working with something ancient, something worth preserving, even if they did not fully understand its original function. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeological methods became more sophisticated, as the science of excavation developed its careful techniques of stratigraphy and recording, the baths were properly studied. The vaulted frigidarium with its massive walls, the remnants of the heating systems, the sophisticated waterproofing, all of this could now be read and interpreted. The public baths of Lutetia, which had once served thousands, which had been central to Roman urban life, could be visited again, their purpose and function restored to understanding if not to use. Beneath the pavee of Notre Dame Cathedral, another kind of discovery unfolded across decades of the 20th century. Routine excavations for parking and utilities kept encountering older layers, kept breaking through medieval foundations to find Roman structures beneath, and beneath those traces of even earlier occupation. The decision was made to preserve what was being found, to create an archaeological crypt where visitors could descend below street level and walk through centuries. In this crypt you can see the layering with your own eyes, can trace how the ground level has risen, how each age built atop what came before. Here are the stone quays of the Roman port, where boats once tied up to unload cargo. Here are the walls of buildings whose upper stories have long since vanished. Here are ceramic pipes, fragments of mosaic, the archaeological vocabulary of a vanished city. The crypt is a vertical journey through time, a place where the palimpsest of Paris becomes readable. Other discoveries came more randomly, more accidentally. A metro excavation encounters a necropolis, the graves of Roman Parisians preserved by chance in a location that was never built over. A building renovation reveals a cellar wall made of precisely fitted Roman stone, reused but still bearing the marks of its original shaping. A garden dig uncovers ceramic fragments, the shattered remains of vessels that once held oil or wine or grain. Each discovery adds to our understanding, fills in gaps in our knowledge of how the city was laid out, how it functioned, who lived there. The archaeological work continues even now, patient and methodical, recovering fragments of the past from beneath the fabric of the present. History, as it comes down to us, is rarely pure. It arrives wrapped in layers of later interpretation, romanticized by storytellers, simplified by those who need clean narratives, distorted by time and wishful thinking. The story of Roman Lutetia is no exception. For generations, certain assumptions about the ancient city were repeated so often they acquired the weight of fact, taught to schoolchildren, written into guidebooks, embedded in the collective imagination of Paris. But archaeology, patient and methodical, tells a different story, one more complex and in some ways more interesting than the legends it displaces. Consider first the question of where the original Celtic settlement stood, that oppidum of the Parisie that predated Roman conquest. Traditional accounts placed it squarely on the Île de la Cité, that island in the Seine that would later become the medieval heart of Paris. This seemed logical, even obvious. Islands make good defensive positions. The later city contracted to the island during times of trouble. Surely the Celts had recognized the same strategic advantages and built there first. But when archaeologists actually excavated on the Ile de la Cité, searching for traces of pre-Roman occupation, they found something puzzling. The evidence for significant Gallic settlement was surprisingly thin. No substantial fortifications, no clear layers of Celtic occupation. The island showed signs of Roman construction, certainly, and medieval structures in abundance, but the pre-Roman layers that should have been there if this had truly been the centre of Gallic Lutetia were largely absent. This absence forces a reconsideration. Perhaps the original settlement stood elsewhere, on the left bank where the Roman city would later flourish, or on higher ground nearby, or scattered across multiple sites along the riverbank. The very name Lutetia, if it indeed derives from words meaning mud or swamp, suggests a settlement tied more to the river's edges than to any single defensible island. The truth is, we do not know for certain where the Parisii built their principal settlement before the Romans came. The ground keeps its secrets better than we would like. This uncertainty, this gap in our knowledge, should not disappoint us but rather remind us of something important. The past is not fully recoverable. We work with fragments, with traces, with hints and suggestions. The grand narratives we construct from these fragments are always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence appears or old assumptions prove untenable. This humility before complexity is not weakness but intellectual honesty. Another persistent myth imagines Roman Lutetia as something like Pompeii, a city frozen in time, its structures preserved more or less intact beneath the streets of modern Paris, waiting to be excavated and revealed in their completeness. This fantasy has particular appeal. We want to believe that if we dug deep enough, if we could somehow peel back the layers of later construction, we would find the Roman city whole and entire, its streets and buildings mapped out clearly, a kind of archaeological theme park sleeping beneath the modern metropolis. But this is not what happened. This is not how cities disappear. Lutetia was not buried by volcanic ash in a single catastrophic day. It was systematically dismantled across centuries, its stones carried away to build other things, its spaces filled and built over and transformed beyond recognition. What remains are fragments, scattered and incomplete, enough to reconstruct the basic plan, to understand the general layout and major structures, but nowhere near enough to recreate the city as it was. The amphitheatre that we have already encountered, that structure rediscovered in the 1860s, illustrates this perfectly. What survives is impressive but partial. The foundations, yes. Some of the lower seating, enough to establish the size and orientation, but the upper tiers are gone, plundered for their stone. The decorative elements have vanished. The entrances and exits can be inferred but not fully reconstructed. We can walk through what remains and understand that this was once a place of spectacle and gathering, but we cannot truly see it as the Romans saw it, cannot hear the roar of thousands of voices filling that space. The baths present similar limitations. The vaulted frigidarium survives because it was incorporated into later buildings, because its massive walls proved too difficult to fully dismantle. But the other rooms, the warm baths and hot baths, the changing rooms and exercise yards, these are known more from archaeological traces than from standing architecture. We read them in the foundations, in the remnants of heating systems, in the patterns left in the soil. It requires imagination informed by knowledge of other Roman baths elsewhere to reconstruct what stood here. Even the street plan, that Roman grid we have spoken of with such confidence, is partly reconstruction, partly educated guessing. Some streets in modern Paris do follow Roman alignments. The Rue Saint-Jacques preserves the path of the old Cardo Maximus. But many other Roman streets have vanished entirely. Their course is lost beneath medieval construction or altered by centuries of gradual change. The map of Roman Lutetia that appears in books and museums is a composite, built from archaeological evidence, historical references, and analogies with other Roman cities, all combined with varying degrees of certainty. This process of reconstruction, of taking fragmentary evidence and building interpretive frameworks around it, is necessary and valuable. It allows us to understand the past, to tell coherent stories about how people lived and what their cities looked like. But we must never forget that these reconstructions are not the same as the reality they attempt to capture. They are models, approximations, best guesses based on incomplete information. The past we recover through archaeology is not the past as it actually was, but the past as we can know it, through the traces that survived and the interpretations we impose upon those traces. This does not make the work less valuable. If anything, it makes it more so. The honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, the willingness to revise understanding when new evidence appears, the recognition that we see through a glass darkly, these qualities distinguish genuine scholarship from mere storytelling. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century was not experienced everywhere as catastrophe. In some regions, the transition from Roman to post-Roman rule happened almost imperceptibly. A change of masters more than a change of world. The city on the Seine, increasingly known now as Paris rather than Lutetia, passed into the hands of Frankish rulers who were not strangers to Roman ways, who had lived within or adjacent to the empire for generations, who had absorbed much of its culture even as they carved kingdoms from its territories. The Merovingian dynasty, that first great Frankish ruling house, recognized something valuable in Paris. The city occupied a strategic position on a major river. It controlled crossings and trade routes. It had history, a name that carried weight, associations with Roman civilization that could be claimed and repurposed. And so Paris became, under the Merovingians, something it had never been under Rome, a capital, a seat of royal power, a place where kings held court and issued laws and received tribute. This elevation in status brought transformation. A city that had contracted during the troubles of the 3rd century, that had shrunk to the defensible island, now needed to accommodate the apparatus of kingship. Royal residences were built. Churches rose to serve the spiritual needs of a population now predominantly Christian. Administrative buildings housed the growing bureaucracy required to govern a kingdom. The physical fabric of the city began to change, not through grand planning as the Romans had done, but organically, building by building, responding to immediate needs rather than abstract ideals. The old Roman structures, those ruins on the left bank, continued their slow dissolution. But now they were ruins in a different kind of city, no longer the abandoned remnants of a vanished order, but rather the archaeological substrate beneath a new civilization. The stones that had not already been carted away for reuse were simply incorporated into the landscape. Built around, built over, their Roman identity gradually forgotten as they became just another feature of the terrain. On the island itself, the process of fortification continued. Walls were built or rebuilt, using whatever materials came to hand. Some stones came from the abandoned left bank, blocks that had once formed forum walls or temple facades now serving purely defensive purposes. Other materials were quarried fresh or salvaged from more recent demolitions. The result was a kind of collage, different periods and purposes layered together into structures whose only real unity was functional. They kept enemies out and residents in. The street pattern that emerged in medieval Paris owed little to Roman planning. The rational grid, that expression of classical order and geometric logic, gave way to a more organic arrangement. Streets followed property lines, curved around obstacles, dead-ended unexpectedly. The city grew the way cities grow when no central authority dictates their form, through countless individual decisions about where to build and how to connect one building to another. The result was a tangle that confused visitors, but made perfect sense to residents who knew it from childhood. Churches became the new focal points, replacing the forum and temples as centres of community life. The cathedral that would eventually become Notre Dame began as something much more modest, a church on the island serving the spiritual needs of the population. Other churches dotted the cityscape, each serving its neighbourhood, each with its saints and relics and particular devotions. The religious calendar structured time. The church bells marked the hours. The great feasts brought crowds together. Christianity provided the framework that Roman civic religion had once supplied. The economic life of the city adapted to new circumstances. The grand trade networks of the Roman Empire had fragmented, but trade itself did not cease. It simply reorganized around new routes, new partnerships, new assumptions about what was possible and what was safe. The sign remained crucial. Boats still moved up and down the river carrying goods and people, but now they operated in a more uncertain world, where river piracy was a genuine risk, where political boundaries shifted, where the protection once guaranteed by imperial authority had to be negotiated kingdom by kingdom. The transformation from Roman Lutetia to Frankish Paris happened across generations, so slowly that no individual lifetime could encompass the full change. A child born in the late 5th century might remember grandparents who spoke of the old days, who could point to ruins and name what they had been. But that child's own grandchildren, born in the mid-6th century, would know only the medieval city, would have no direct connection to the Roman past except through stories growing increasingly vague and unreliable. This is how civilizations actually transition, not through dramatic ruptures, but through gradual erosion and replacement, through the slow accumulation of small changes that eventually add up to something fundamentally different. The people living through it might not even recognize that they were witnessing transformation. They were simply living their lives, making the adjustments necessary to survive and prosper under changing circumstances. Yet continuity existed alongside change. The site itself persisted. People still lived here, still raised families and pursued livelihoods, still worried about the harvest and the weather, and the countless ordinary concerns that fill human existence regardless of what empire or kingdom claims dominion. The river still flowed, the island still stood. The very name Paris preserved the memory of the Parisii, those Celtic people who had been here before Rome came, whose tribal identity outlasted the empire that had conquered them. The city that emerged from this long transformation was different from what had come before, but not entirely new. It was built on the same site, using the same stones, serving similar functions. It was a palimpsest where each layer partially obscured but never completely erased what lay beneath. Medieval Paris carried within itself the ghost of Roman Lutetia, invisible but present, sleeping beneath the streets. Walk through modern Paris today, and you walk, quite literally, on the shoulders of ancients. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract sense, but physically. The street beneath your feet is elevated 15 or 20 feet above the Roman ground level, built up through centuries of accumulation, of debris and construction, and the simple processes that cause cities to rise. With each step you tread upon layers of human occupation, stretching back through medieval times, through the Frankish period, through late Roman decline, back to the confident days when Lutetia was new and the empire seemed eternal. Some streets preserve more than altitude, they preserve direction, orientation, the basic logic of how to move through space. The Rue Saint-Jacques, that long thoroughfare running through the Latin Quarter, follows almost exactly the path of the ancient Cardo Maximus, the main north-south axis of Roman Lutetia. Stand on this street and you stand where Romans stood, though 20 feet higher. The modern pavement covers Roman paving stones, which in turn covered the original ground. But the line itself, the basic route from here to there, has remained constant for 2,000 years. This persistence is not unique to the Rue Saint-Jacques. Other streets, though their names and surfaces have changed countless times, still follow routes established in the Roman period, routes that made sense given the topography, the river crossings, the locations of important buildings. Medieval builders, having no memory of Roman planning, nevertheless often found that the logical path from one place to another was the same path the Romans had used. Function dictates form, geography constrains choice. And so the medieval street network, for all its organic tangles and unexpected turns, sometimes echoes the Roman grid beneath. This layering extends below the streets, into the very ground itself. Archaeologists excavating anywhere in central Paris expect to encounter multiple strata, each representing a different period of occupation. At the deepest levels, if you dig far enough, you might find traces of Neolithic settlement, those first humans who recognized this location as favourable, who fished the river and hunted the forests thousands of years before cities were imagined. Above that, evidence of Celtic occupation, the Parisii whose name would outlast their material culture. Then Roman layers, identifiable by their distinctive ceramic styles, their particular building techniques, their coins bearing imperial portraits. Above the Roman layers come medieval strata, darker soils mixed with the debris of wooden buildings, of organic materials that have largely decomposed but left their signature in the dirt. Then early modern layers, then modern, each distinct to the trained eye, each telling its own story about how people lived at that particular moment. The ground beneath Paris is a book, its pages stacked vertically, waiting to be read by those who know the language of archaeology. But the continuity is not merely physical, it exists in patterns of life that persist despite surface transformations. People still gather by the river because the river provides what it always provided: water, transportation, a natural focal point for human activity. The island remains central because islands remain defensible, because crossing points naturally become important, because some logics of geography transcend particular political arrangements or cultural contexts. The name itself carries continuity forward. Paris, derived from Parisium, preserves across 2 millennia the identity of a Celtic tribe that was already ancient when Rome arrived. How many cities can claim such longevity of naming? How many places maintain linguistic connection to their founding peoples across so vast a span of time? The word Paris, spoken by millions who have no idea of its origins, who use it simply as a label for a modern city, nevertheless carries within it an unbroken thread reaching back to tribal councils and riverside settlements that existed before Latin was spoken here, before Christianity was conceived, before the Roman Empire was founded. This should give us pause, should invite reflection on the deep patterns of human settlement. Cities are not arbitrary. They arise in particular places for particular reasons, and those reasons often remain valid across the rise and fall of empires, across technological revolutions, across complete transformations of culture and governance. A good harbour remains a good harbour regardless of whether you navigate by stars or satellites. A defensive position remains defensible, whether you defend with spears or missiles. The Seine flows past Paris now exactly as it flowed past Lutetia, indifferent to human names and nations. Consider what it means to live in such a place, to inhabit a location that has been continuously occupied for thousands of years. Every cellar you descend into might break through into older structures. Every construction project might encounter the unexpected. A Roman wall, a medieval well, a scatter of Celtic pottery. The past is not safely buried and finished, but rather constantly resurfacing, constantly making its presence felt, constantly reminding the living that they are not the first to walk these streets, to draw water from this river, to call this place home. This persistence has a quality both humbling and reassuring. Humbling because it reminds us that our own moment, however important it seems, is merely one more layer in an ongoing accumulation, one more brief occupation that will eventually be buried and forgotten like all the others. But reassuring too because it suggests that human communities can endure, can adapt, can survive transformations that seem catastrophic when you're living through them. Roman Lutetia fell, but Paris rose from its ruins. The empire vanished, but the city persisted. The grand monuments crumbled, but people continued to live here, to make lives here, to build new structures atop old foundations. This is perhaps the most important lesson that Lutetia teaches us, that continuity and change are not opposites but partners, that transformation does not require destruction, that what endures is not the particular form of things but the deeper patterns of human need and human adaptation. The forum is gone, but people still gather. The baths are ruins, but people still bathe. The amphitheatre stands empty, but people still seek entertainment and spectacle. The surface changes, the technology evolves, the institutions transform, but beneath it all, the basic human needs that created cities in the first place remain constant. If you were to visit Paris today, if you walked its streets with eyes open to history, you could still encounter traces of Lutetia, fragments of the Roman city that survived despite everything. They are not obvious, they do not announce themselves with grandeur. But they are there, waiting patiently for those who care to look, who care to descend beneath the modern surface and touch, however briefly, that older world. Begin in the 5th arrondissement, in a quiet neighbourhood park called the Arène de Lutèce. Here, surrounded by apartment buildings and the ordinary bustle of a residential Paris, stand the remains of the amphitheatre. Not the complete structure, not the tiered marvel that once held thousands, but enough. The lower sections of seating survive, carved stone benches that curve around an oval space. The arena floor is now grass, kept trim by municipal gardeners. Children play where gladiators once fought, where animals were baited, where crowds gathered for spectacles we can only imagine. Walk down to those stone benches, sit where Romans sat nearly 2,000 years ago. The stone is worn smooth by weather and time, but it is the same stone, cut and placed by hands that have been dust for millennia. Touch it. Feel the weight of its presence, the solidity that has outlasted empire and conquest, plague and revolution, the rise and fall of countless human arrangements. This stone has witnessed more than any human life could encompass. It was old when the Black Death swept through Paris. It was ancient when the French Revolution tore the city apart. It simply endures, patient and mute. The amphitheatre today serves as a kind of hybrid space, part archaeological site, part public park. Locals use it for recreation, for picnics, for casual football games. Tourists come to photograph the ruins, to check another site off their lists. But sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, when the crowds thin and the light slants low across the stones, you can almost sense what this place was, can almost hear the echo of voices that once filled this space with sound and energy. Almost, but not quite. The past remains stubbornly past, accessible only in fragments and imagination. Not far away, though you must know where to look, lie the remains of the Roman baths. They form part of the Musée de Cluny, that museum dedicated to medieval art. But the bath complex predates the medieval building by centuries. Descend into these spaces, and you enter a different world, a world of massive stone vaults and brick construction, of spaces designed for specific purposes that are no longer immediately obvious to modern eyes. The frigidarium, the cold bath chamber, stands nearly intact, its vaulted ceiling soaring overhead, its walls thick enough to have survived everything time could throw at them. The scale is impressive, speaking to the ambition and engineering skill of Roman builders. This was public architecture meant to serve hundreds, to accommodate the daily rhythm of bathing that was so central to Roman urban life. The water that once filled these chambers, heated by complex systems of furnaces and channels, has long since drained away. The steam and voices and splash of bodies are gone, but the space itself remains, a hollow echo of former function. Stand in the frigidarium and try to imagine it in use. The acoustics are remarkable, sound bouncing off stone surfaces in ways that must have created a particular sonic environment, conversations echoing, water sounds amplified. Close your eyes and you might almost reconstruct it, might almost populate these empty chambers with the crowds who once claimed them as their own. But open your eyes, and you face only stone and silence. The past retreated to whatever realm vanished things inhabit. For the most complete encounter with layered Paris, you must visit the archaeological crypt beneath the square in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. Descend the stairs from the modern plaza, and you enter a carefully preserved underground space where centuries are laid out for inspection. Here you can see the progression clearly, can trace how the ground level has risen, how each age built atop what came before. The remains are fragmentary but evocative. Stone quays where Roman boats once tied up, foundation walls of buildings whose upper stories vanished centuries ago, clay pipes that carried water, fragments of mosaic flooring, the detritus and foundations of ordinary urban life, preserved by the accident of being buried rather than dismantled. Each artifact, each wall section, each fragment of pavement is labelled, explained, placed within the larger chronology of the city's development. Walking through this crypt is like reading a book where each page is a different chapter of history. Here is Celtic occupation, minimal but present. Here is the Roman period, more substantial, more architecturally ambitious. Here are medieval layers, built from stones cannibalized from Roman structures, creating new forms from old materials. The narrative of the city's transformation is written in stone and soil, readable to those who have learned the language of archaeology. But perhaps the most profound encounter with ancient Lutetia requires no particular site, no museum or preserved ruin. It requires only awareness, only the knowledge that beneath every step you take in central Paris lies this hidden stratum of history. Walk down any street in the Latin Quarter, and you walk above Roman streets. Enter any old building and your cellar might extend into Roman foundations. The city is built on itself, layer upon layer, a vertical accumulation of human occupation spanning millennia. This invisible presence has a quality that is almost spiritual, a sense of connection to vast stretches of time and to countless lives lived in this place. Every person who walks these streets joins a procession that stretches back beyond memory, beyond written record, back to the first humans who recognized this location as favourable for settlement. You're not separate from that history but continuous with it. Another brief moment in the long story of human habitation at this bend in the Seine. What does the story of Lutetia teach us? We who live in our own cities, who build our own monuments, who imagine our own arrangements to be permanent. The lessons are not simple, not reducible to easy morals or straightforward warnings. but they are worth contemplating as we prepare to close this chapter of history and return to our own moment. The first lesson is about impermanence. The Romans who built Lutetia, who laid out its streets and raised its forums and carved its amphitheatre from stone, surely believed they were building for eternity. The empire seemed invincible, its systems rational and effective, its power overwhelming. Why would such an order not last forever? And yet it did not. The grand structures fell into ruin. The sophisticated infrastructure decayed. The very name of the city was lost and replaced. Nothing that humans build, no matter how solid it seems, no matter how carefully planned or ambitiously executed, is guaranteed permanence. This should humble us but not paralyze us. We too build cities, create systems, imagine that our arrangements will endure, and perhaps they will, for a time. But a time is not forever. The buildings we erect, the institutions we establish, the certainties we hold, all of these are contingent, temporary, subject to forces we cannot fully control or even predict. To acknowledge this is not pessimism but realism, a clear-eyed recognition of the human condition. Yet there is a second lesson, one that balances the first. While the structures of Roman Lutetia crumbled, while the empire that created them fell, the place itself persisted. People continued to live on the banks of the Seine. They adapted to new circumstances, built new structures, created new forms of community and governance. The transformation was profound, even traumatic for those who lived through it, but it was not the end. Life continued. Families were raised, work was done, stories were told. The thread of human occupation did not break but merely changed its character. This suggests a kind of resilience that operates at a deeper level than political systems or architectural monuments. Human communities can survive the collapse of the institutions that structure them. They can adapt to circumstances that would have seemed catastrophic from the perspective of earlier prosperity. What endures is not the particular form but the underlying human capacity to organize, to cooperate, to create meaning and order even from chaos and ruin. Consider what this means for our own age, we who face our own challenges, our own potential transformations. The systems we rely on, the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, the global networks of trade and communication that we take for granted, all of these are complex human constructions no less contingent than Roman aqueducts or amphitheatres. They could fail, they could transform beyond recognition, and if they did, if our own certainties proved as fragile as Roman certainties, what then? The story of Lutetia suggests that while such transformation would be difficult, while the loss of familiar structures and systems would be genuinely painful, it would not necessarily be the end. Human communities have survived worse. They have rebuilt from ruins, have created new forms from the wreckage of the old, have maintained the thread of occupation and identity across chasms that seemed unbridgeable. This is not to minimize suffering or to romanticize collapse, but simply to acknowledge a certain fundamental tenacity in human social organization. There is a third lesson, one about memory and forgetting. The Roman city became invisible, not because it was destroyed, but because it was forgotten, because the knowledge of what it had been was lost across generations. The stones remained, but no one could read them. The spaces persisted, but no one recognized their purpose. This forgetting was almost more complete than physical destruction would have been, because it left the evidence in place but removed the ability to interpret it. What do we forget? What knowledge? What understanding? What hard-won lessons disappear when civilizations transform, when the thread of transmission breaks, when no one remains who remembers how things worked or why they mattered? The rediscovery of Lutetia required archaeology, required patient reconstruction from fragments, required the application of scholarly method to materials that had lost their original context. How much was irrecoverably lost, how many nuances and details and understandings that no amount of excavation can recover. This should make us more careful about preservation, not merely of physical structures, but of knowledge itself, of understanding, of the accumulated wisdom that each generation receives from those who came before. When that thread breaks, when knowledge is lost, recovering it is difficult and incomplete. Better to maintain continuity than to have to reconstruct from ruins. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about perspective, about the proper scale on which to measure human achievement and human life. From the vantage of deep time, from the perspective that encompasses millennia rather than decades, our own moment appears different. The urgent concerns that fill our days, the political dramas and economic anxieties and social conflicts that seem so important, all of these will someday be nothing more than thin layers in the archaeological record, barely distinguishable from the layers immediately above and below. This is not nihilism. It is not a claim that nothing matters because everything passes. Rather, it is an invitation to a different kind of maturity, a recognition that while our individual lives are brief and our civilizations temporary, we are part of something larger and more enduring. The human project, the long effort to create meaning and order and beauty in a universe that offers none of these things automatically, continues across the rise and fall of particular societies and systems. We are participants in that larger story, contributors to something that extends far beyond our own lifespans. And so we return to where we began, to Paris at night, to the thought of Roman stones sleeping beneath modern streets. The city above is bright with electric light, loud with traffic, filled with millions of people pursuing their own purposes in their own moment. But beneath the noise and light and bustle lies that other city, that silent world of forum and bath and amphitheatre, patient and waiting, neither fully gone nor fully present. Between these two cities, separated by centuries and yet occupying the same space, there exists a kind of dialogue, a conversation across time about what endures and what passes, about human ambition and human limits, about the terrible fragility and the surprising resilience of everything we build. Sleep well, knowing that you too are part of this long story, that the ground beneath you carries the weight of those who came before, and that someday, impossibly distant but certain, others will walk where you walked, will wonder about your life as you have wondered about theirs. The stones remember nothing, but we remember for them, and in remembering keep faith with the long human project of making sense of our brief passage through time.